1945. Japanese women prisoners burst into mocking laughter when American soldiers first approached them. They'd been taught these men were subhuman demons who would torture them to death. Within months, these same women were writing in their secret diaries about dreams of marrying their captors and escaping to America. What could American soldiers have possibly done to completely shatter everything these women believed about the world? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. In the spring of 1944, Japan was a nation built on iron rules and absolute obedience. Emperor Hirohito's portrait hung in every classroom, every government office, every train station across the empire. Children learned to bow before it each morning. Women learned their place was in service to the nation, first as daughters, then as wives, then as mothers raising sons for the military. The entire country moved like a single machine, every person a gear turning in the same direction. For young Japanese women, life followed a strict path laid out before birth. They attended schools where teachers told them that their greatest honor was serving Japan. They joined patriotic women's associations, where older women taught them to sew uniforms, roll bandages, and prepare care packages for soldiers. They learned that their bodies belonged to the empire. Their thoughts belonged to the emperor. Their futures were predetermined by men they would likely never meet until their wedding day. The propaganda reached into every corner of daily existence. Posters on city walls showed American and British soldiers as horned demons with fangs and claws. Radio broadcasts described enemy troops as savage beasts who knew nothing of honor or mercy. Newspapers printed stories of atrocities, real and imagined, committed by Allied forces across the Pacific. Teachers in schools made students repeat these lessons until the words became automatic. Americans were kichikubei, demonic fiends from across the ocean who wanted to destroy Japanese culture and enslave Japanese people. By 1945, the economic situation had become desperate beyond anything most Japanese civilians had experienced. American submarines blockaded the islands, cutting off food shipments and raw materials. Rice rations shrank to tiny portions that left families hungry every night. Vegetables became luxuries. Meat disappeared entirely from most tables. City dwellers foraged for wild plants in parks and along roadsides. Children stopped growing properly. Adults grew thin and weak. The government told people that sacrifice was noble, that hunger was patriotic, that suffering proved loyalty to the emperor. The firebombing campaigns had turned Japan's major cities into landscapes of ash and rubble. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, once proud urban centers with millions of residents, became fields of blackened wood and twisted metal. Families lived in makeshift shelters built from salvaged materials. Schools held classes outdoors because the buildings had burned. Hospitals ran out of medicine, bandages, and clean water. The dead outnumbered the living in some neighborhoods. Yet the government insisted victory was near, that Japan's spirit would overcome American industry. Women served the war effort in countless ways. Thousands worked as military nurses, trained in basic medical care, but expected to serve without question in field hospitals and aid stations. Others worked in factories, manufacturing weapons, ammunition, and supplies. Some served as civilian auxiliaries attached to military units, cooking, cleaning, and managing supplies. A darker group existed too. Women forced or coerced into comfort stations, where they served as sexual slaves for Japanese soldiers, though the military called them volunteers serving the empire. The military code of Bushido dominated every aspect of how Japanese forces fought. Surrender was worse than death. Capture meant eternal shame, not just for the soldier, but for their entire family back home. Soldiers were expected to fight to the last bullet, then use their final bullet on themselves. If they had no bullets left, they should use grenades, swords, or their bare hands until the enemy killed them. But they must never, ever allow themselves to be taken alive. This code applied to women serving with the military as well. As American forces island-hopped across the Pacific, thousands of Japanese military personnel and civilians found themselves trapped. On Saipan, in June 1944, hundreds of Japanese civilians jumped from cliffs rather than face capture. On Okinawa in 1945, the civilian death toll reached over 100,000 as people chose suicide over surrender. Women serving as nurses and auxiliaries faced impossible choices as American forces closed in. Everything they had been taught said capture meant torture, rape, and execution. Better to die by their own hand with dignity intact. The captures happened anyway, despite the propaganda and despite the fear. Some women were too wounded to resist. Others were knocked unconscious by explosions or overcome by smoke and fire. A few froze in terror as American soldiers surrounded them. They woke up in American hands, the nightmare they had been promised their entire lives now seemingly about to begin. Their training said this was the end. Their culture said they were already dead, ghosts who had failed their duty. In the spring of 1945, a group of captured Japanese women, nurses, auxiliaries, and others caught in the final Pacific battles, found themselves loaded onto American transport vehicles. They wept openly. Some tried to bite their own tongues to bleed to death before worse could happen. Others remained rigid with shock, eyes unfocused, minds retreating to safer places inside themselves. They ranged in age from barely 18 to their mid-30s. Most had never traveled beyond their home prefecture before the war. Now they were prisoners of the demons they had learned to fear since childhood. The journey to the POW camp felt like a descent into hell itself. They expected beatings at any moment. They expected soldiers to drag them away one by one. They watched American guards with the intensity of rabbits watching wolves, trying to predict when the attack would come. But the Americans mostly ignored them, smoking cigarettes and talking among themselves in their harsh, incomprehensible language. The trucks had springs that cushioned the ride. The Americans had given them water in clean canteens. Nothing made sense yet. When the first American soldier approached their group with chocolate bars and offered them with a smile, the women responded with laughter. But it was not happy laughter. It was the sharp, bitter sound of people whose minds could not process what they were seeing. Chocolate meant poison, obviously. The smile meant mockery. This was part of the torture, the psychological breaking before the physical pain began. They pushed the chocolate away. Some spat on the ground. Others covered their faces and turned their backs, refusing to participate in whatever sick game this was. The soldier looked confused. He said something to another American, shrugged, and walked away. The chocolate bars sat on the ground where he had placed them. The women stared at them as the sun climbed higher and the day grew hot. Hours passed. The chocolate melted slightly in the heat. No one touched it. No one dared. They had been taught that American kindness was a lie, a trap, a prelude to cruelty. Their laughter had been a shield, a desperate attempt to show they would not break easily, that Japanese women had courage, even when facing demons. But deep in that laughter, beneath the fear and the bravado, lay the first tiny seed of doubt, because the soldier's face had shown confusion, not anger. He had walked away instead of forcing them, and the chocolate remained there, unclaimed, as the first crack appeared in the wall of everything they believed they knew about their enemy. They did not know it yet, but their entire world was about to turn inside out. The real shock was not captured. The real shock was still coming, waiting just beyond the gates of the camp they could see in the distance, where American flags snapped in the Pacific wind and the smell of cooking food drifted on the breeze like a rumor of impossible things. The POW camp sat on flat ground, with rows of wooden barracks painted a dull gray-green. Guard towers rose at each corner, but the guards seemed relaxed, almost bored. The women shuffled through the gates in a tight group, still expecting violence at any moment. They were directed to a processing building where American female soldiers waited. The sight of women in military uniforms giving orders to male soldiers created a confusion so deep that several of the Japanese prisoners simply stopped walking and stared. In Japan, women bowed to men. Women served tea and kept quiet. Women did not wear pants or carry clipboards or tell men what to do. The female soldiers spoke through interpreters, asking names and basic information. They checked the prisoners for injuries and diseases. Their hands were gentle but professional. They looked the Japanese women in the eyes when they spoke, treating them as equals rather than as defeated enemies or shameful captives. This created another crack in the wall of expectations. One young nurse from Osaka kept touching her own face, as if checking whether she was still real, still herself, still the person she had been that morning. The barracks they were assigned held rows of individual cots, each with a thin mattress, a pillow, 2 blankets, and a small wooden box for personal belongings. In Japan, families slept on futons laid directly on tatami mats, often sharing rooms with multiple people. Privacy was a luxury almost no one knew. Here, each woman had her own sleeping space with actual cushioning between her body and the ground. The barracks had electric lights that worked with the flip of a switch. There were real bathrooms with running water, toilets that flushed, and sinks with soap. The soap smelled like flowers, not the harsh lye soap they had used back home when soap existed at all. That first evening, bells rang for dinner. The women walked to the mess hall, expecting thin rice gruel and maybe some pickled vegetables if they were lucky. What they found instead made several of them gasp out loud. Long tables held trays of food in quantities they had not seen in years. There was white rice, not the mixture of rice and barley scraps they had eaten during rationing. There were vegetables, multiple kinds, cooked and seasoned. There was meat, actual meat, chicken and pork, in portions larger than what a Japanese army officer might receive. There was bread, soft and white, with butter. There was milk to drink, cold and fresh. The women stood frozen, staring at the food. An American soldier gestured for them to take plates and serve themselves. They moved like people in a dream, slowly filling their plates while glancing around for the trick, the moment when this would be snatched away. They sat at tables and took tiny bites, testing for poison or spoilage. The food was good. The food was better than good. It was better than anything most of them had eaten in 2 years. One woman began crying silently into her rice, tears dripping onto her plate as her body recognized nourishment it had been denied for so long. After dinner, they whispered among themselves in their barracks. Why were the Americans feeding them so well? Were they being fattened for something worse? Was this special food before execution, a final mercy before death? Nothing in their training or propaganda had prepared them for this. Demons did not serve 3 hot meals. Barbarians did not provide clean beds and working toilets. The cognitive dissonance created a buzzing anxiety in their minds, like static on a radio that would not tune to any clear station. The next morning brought breakfast. More food, more abundance. Eggs, toast, jam, fruit. Some of the women had never tasted jam before. The sweetness exploded in their mouths like a small miracle. Throughout the day, they watched American soldiers going about their duties. The soldiers ate the same food from the same kitchen. They smiled and joked with each other. They played baseball during breaks, shouting and laughing like children. They showed each other photographs from wallets, pictures of families and girlfriends and hometowns. They looked human. They looked normal. They looked nothing like the monsters in the propaganda posters. Supply trucks arrived daily, sometimes multiple times per day. The women watched from behind the fence as Americans unloaded crate after crate of goods. Food, medicine, clothing, equipment, all in quantities that seemed impossible. One truck carried nothing but Coca-Cola bottles, hundreds of them clinking in wooden cases. The driver handed them out to soldiers like they were nothing special. Back in Japan, a single bottle of soda would have been a treasure worth trading for a week's rations. Here, soldiers drank them casually, then tossed the empty bottles into trash bins. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. A week into their captivity, medical personnel examined all the prisoners thoroughly. They used equipment the women had never seen before: stethoscopes, blood pressure cuffs, thermometers that did not need to be held under the tongue for long minutes. They gave injections to prevent disease. They treated infections with pills that made fevers disappear within days. In Japan, such medicine did not exist, or existed only for the highest military officers and government officials. Here, prisoners received it freely. A woman with a persistent cough that had plagued her for months received antibiotics and recovered completely in 10 days. She kept touching her chest in wonder, breathing deeply without pain. The Americans offered activities to fill the long days. There were English classes taught by patient teachers who used simple words and lots of gestures. There were craft sessions where women could make things with materials provided free. There was a library with books, though most could not read English yet. On Sundays, there were movie screenings in a large tent with a projector and a white sheet for a screen. The first movie they watched showed American families in houses with cars and lawns and children playing. The houses looked clean and spacious. The families looked happy and well-fed. Every person in the movie looked healthier than anyone the Japanese women had seen in Japan for the past 2 years. One afternoon in July, American soldiers set up tables outside and brought out strange machines that churned and froze. They were making ice cream for Independence Day. The women had heard of ice cream, but most had never tasted it. The soldiers handed out small bowls of vanilla ice cream, cold and sweet and impossibly smooth. A young woman from Kyoto took one bite and started laughing, real laughter this time, not the bitter shield laughter from that first day. She could not stop laughing, and soon others joined her, laughing at the absurdity of eating frozen cream in a prison camp while their country burned, laughing at how good it tasted, laughing because their minds had no other way to process the overwhelming strangeness of their situation. The contrast grew sharper with each passing day. They remembered Tokyo, the city they had left behind. Buildings reduced to ash, children with hollow cheeks and empty eyes, mothers watering down soup to make it last longer, old people dying quietly in corners because there was no medicine, no food, no help coming. They remembered propaganda speeches promising that Japan's spiritual strength would overcome American material weakness, that suffering built character while American softness built nothing. But here was American softness made real: 3 meals a day, medical care, clean water, safety, even ice cream. And here was Japanese spiritual strength made real too. It meant hunger, death, and cities on fire. The equation they had been taught all their lives was backwards. Material abundance did not make people weak. It made them strong enough to be generous, even to enemies. Spiritual purity without food or medicine just meant watching people die while telling yourself it meant something. At night, Women whispered conversations in the darkness of their barracks. They spoke carefully, afraid that admitting doubt might be its own kind of betrayal. But the doubts came anyway, creeping in like water through cracks in a dam. If the Americans were demons, why had they not been harmed? If American society was corrupt and weak, how did they have so much? If Japan was winning the war through superior spirit, why were Japanese people starving while American prisoners ate meat twice a day? The questions had no good answers, only the increasingly obvious truth that everything they had been told was a lie. And if that was a lie, what else was a lie? What else had they been taught that was backwards, upside down, completely wrong? The ground beneath their understanding of the world had started to shift, and nothing would ever be stable again. Christmas 1945 arrived cold and clear, 4 months after Japan's surrender, but worlds away from anything the women had known before. The Americans decorated the mess hall with paper chains and pine branches brought from somewhere off the base. Red and green streamers hung from the ceiling. A small tree stood in the corner, covered with handmade ornaments and strings of popcorn. The women had heard of Christmas from missionaries before the war, but they had never celebrated it, never understood why anyone would make such a fuss over the birth of someone else's God. The evening meal that day went beyond anything they had experienced so far. The cooks had prepared turkey, a bird so large it could feed 20 people. There was stuffing made with bread and herbs. There were mashed potatoes swimming in butter and gravy. There were sweet potatoes with brown sugar melted on top. There were rolls so soft they fell apart in your hands. There were pies, multiple kinds, with crusts that flaked and fillings that tasted like concentrated autumn. The abundance was almost violent in its generosity, as if the Americans were trying to prove something through sheer quantity of food. But it was not the food that broke them. It was what happened after. American soldiers moved between the tables, sitting down with the prisoners, showing them photographs from their wallets. One young soldier with red hair and freckles sat across from a nurse named Keiko. He pulled out a small photograph of a young woman with dark hair and serious eyes. His sister, he explained through an interpreter. She was 22 years old. She worked in a hospital in California. She wanted to be a doctor someday. His voice went soft when he talked about her. His eyes got wet. He missed her, he said. He had not seen her in 2 years. Keiko stared at the photograph. The American sister looked like her. Same age, same serious expression, same slim build. Same dreams of healing people. In that moment, something inside Keiko's chest cracked open like an egg. This American soldier loved his sister the way Keiko's brother had loved her before he died at Iwo Jima. This American sister worked in a hospital the way Keiko had worked in a field hospital before capture. They were the same. The American family and the Japanese family were the same. The enemies were the same. The humans were the same. She started crying, which startled the soldier. He offered her his handkerchief, a clean, white square of cloth that smelled like laundry soap. She took it and pressed it against her face, sobbing into the kindness of this small gesture, this piece of clean fabric freely given. That night, she wrote in the diary she had started keeping, practicing the English words she had learned. Today, an American soldier showed me a picture of his sister. She looked like me. He cried. I realized, they are human. We are human. The English classes had become more than just language lessons. The teacher, a middle-aged American woman with gray hair and patient hands, taught them words, but also ideas that had no real equivalent in Japanese. She taught them about democracy, about voting, about choosing leaders instead of obeying ones chosen by birth. She taught them about individual rights, The strange American idea that every person had value and freedom that even the government could not take away. She taught them that American women could vote, could own property, could choose their own husbands or choose not to marry at all. This last idea hit the Japanese women like lightning. In Japan, marriages were arranged by families. A woman's father chose her husband based on family connections and social standing. Love was not part of the equation. The wife moved into her husband's family home and served his parents until they died. She had no money of her own, no property, no legal rights separate from her husband. If he beat her, that was family business. If he took mistresses, that was expected. Her job was to produce sons and keep quiet. But American women chose. They dated men, multiple men sometimes, going to movies and restaurants and dances. They decided for themselves who they would marry. Some chose not to marry at all and lived independent lives. They could divorce husbands who treated them badly. They could work and keep their own money. They could buy houses and cars. They existed as full people, not as attachments to fathers and husbands. The weight of this knowledge pressed down on the prisoners like heavy rain. One woman named Yuki wrote in her diary, "In captivity, I became more free than I ever was at home." She meant it literally. In the POW camp, she could walk around without asking permission. She could read books of her choosing. She could talk to men without a chaperone. She could learn English and dream about possibilities. Back home, her parents had arranged her marriage to a man 40 years older than her, a wealthy merchant who wanted a young wife to show off. She had met him twice before the wedding. After the wedding, she had no choice but to obey. The dream started small and grew larger. At first, the women just imagined having enough food. Then they imagined having houses with electricity and running water. Then they imagined having jobs and money of their own. Then they imagined having husbands who treated them as partners instead of servants. The American soldiers who guarded them, who brought them food, who taught them English, who showed them photographs of their sisters. These men became symbols of everything they could not have in Japan. The dreams of marriage were not about romance, not really. They were about escape. They were about going to a country where women voted and owned property and chose their own paths. They were about leaving behind the ashes of Tokyo and the rigid rules of a society that had lied to them their whole lives. They were about becoming the kind of woman they saw in American movies. The kind who laughed loudly and wore pants and drove cars and seemed afraid of nothing. Some women began practicing American manners, the way Americans shook hands and looked each other in the eyes. They learned to dance to American music, awkward at first, but gradually finding the rhythm. They asked questions about America constantly. What were the houses like? What were the schools like? Could women really go to college? Could they really work as doctors and lawyers? The Americans said, yes, yes, all of it was true. And with each yes, the women felt the walls of their old world crumbling a little more, until there was nothing left standing except the truth. They had been kept small on purpose, and there was a whole world out there where women could be large. The repatriation ships left from various Pacific ports throughout 1946 and into early 1947, carrying thousands of Japanese prisoners back to their homeland. The women who had spent months or years in American custody stood on the decks, watching the coast of whatever island they were leaving fade into the distance. They carried small bags with their few possessions. Inside those bags were things that would have seemed like trash to Americans, but were treasures beyond measure to them. Photographs of American soldiers who had become friends, addresses written on scraps of paper, English textbooks with careful notes in the margins, a few chocolate bar wrappers saved and pressed flat. One woman carried a clean white handkerchief given to her by a soldier on Christmas. Another carried a small American flag no bigger than her hand. The journey back took weeks on slow ships across the Pacific. The women had time to think, time to remember, time to worry about what waited for them. They knew Japan had surrendered. They knew the cities had been bombed, but they did not know the full extent of the destruction, could not imagine it even though they tried. They talked among themselves about what they would say to their families, how they would explain their survival, whether anyone would believe what they had experienced in the camps. Some practiced lies, stories that would be easier to accept than the truth. Others decided to say nothing at all, to lock their American experiences away in private corners of their hearts. The first sight of Japan's coast brought a strange mixture of emotions. Relief at coming home, dread at what home had become, guilt for having eaten well while their countrymen starved, confusion about whether they even belonged here anymore, whether they could fit back into a society they had learned to see with different eyes. The ship docked at a port that looked nothing like the busy, organized facility they had left from. The buildings were damaged or destroyed. The docks were makeshift repairs held together with salvaged materials. Everything looked gray and tired and broken. Walking off the ship felt like stepping backwards in time, but not to the Japan they remembered. This was worse than what they had left. Tokyo, for those returning to the capital, was a landscape of ash and rubble that stretched for miles in every direction. Where there had been neighborhoods with wooden houses and small shops, there were now empty lots with a few walls still standing like broken teeth. Where there had been department stores and theaters and restaurants, there were concrete foundations and twisted metal. The imperial palace still stood, but around it spread devastation so complete it looked like the surface of the moon. The people looked worse than the buildings. Everyone was thin, dangerously thin, with skin stretched tight over bones and eyes that seemed too large for their faces. Children had the blank stares of old people. Old people looked like living skeletons. Women wore patched clothing that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. Men shuffled more than walked, conserving energy because there was no food to create more. The contrast with American abundance hit the returning prisoners like a physical blow. They had known Japan was suffering. They had not known it was this bad. Keiko returned to her family home in a Tokyo suburb to find only the foundation and part of one wall remaining. Her mother and younger sister had survived by living in a shelter made from sheets of corrugated metal. Her father had died in the firebombing. Her older brother had died at Iwo Jima. When she arrived, her mother did not embrace her. Instead, she turned away, her face tight with shame. Keiko had allowed herself to be captured. She had survived when she should have died. She had dishonored the family by living. The reunion Keiko had imagined, the crying and hugging and joy at being alive, never happened. Her mother spoke to her in short, clipped sentences. Her sister would not look at her. Neighbors who saw her return whispered behind their hands. She heard the words they used: prisoner, coward, damaged goods. No family would allow their son to marry a woman who had been in American hands. Everyone assumed she had been raped, used, broken. The truth that the Americans had treated her with respect and kindness was impossible to speak aloud. It would sound like a lie, or worse, like collaboration with the enemy. Yuki returned to her home prefecture to find her elderly husband had died during the war. Instead of relief, this brought new problems. His family blamed her for his death somehow, claimed she had brought bad luck by being captured. They refused to let her stay in the family house. They wanted nothing to do with a woman who had surrendered. She had nowhere to go, no money, no options in a country where women could not easily live alone. She found work as an English teacher, using the skills she had learned in the camp. The pay was tiny, but it was something. She rented a corner of a room in a boarding house and lived on rice and pickles, just like everyone else. But Yuki had addresses. She had letters from American soldiers who had promised to write. Over the months that followed, letters arrived from America, passed through military postal systems and Japanese authorities who read everything, looking for security threats. The letters were friendly, asking how she was doing, telling her about life back in America. One soldier, a young man from Ohio who had taught her English, wrote that if she ever wanted to come to America, he would help her. He was not proposing marriage, not yet, but the implication hung in the air like perfume. A small number of women began the complex process of trying to emigrate. The American occupation authorities had rules about Japanese war brides, but the rules kept changing. Some women who had formed real relationships with American soldiers during the occupation managed to marry and move to the United States starting in 1947. The process took months or years of paperwork, interviews, and waiting. Families often disowned daughters who chose this path, saw it as a final betrayal, marrying the enemy who had destroyed Japan. Those who stayed in Japan found themselves caught between two worlds. They could not unsee what they had seen. They could not unknown what they had learned. When the American occupation brought reforms, including giving women the right to vote in 1945, these former prisoners understood what it meant in ways other Japanese women did not. They had seen women voting, seen women in positions of authority, seen what equality looked like in practice. They became teachers, translators, advocates for women's rights. They taught their children English. They told carefully edited stories about their time in American custody, leaving out the parts about abundance and kindness, because those parts sounded too much like fantasy. The years passed, and Japan slowly rebuilt. The Korean War brought American military contracts and economic recovery. Cities rose from the ashes, modern and organized. People began eating regular meals again. The desperation faded into memory. But the women who had been American prisoners carried their experiences like secret weights. They had learned that propaganda was lies. They had learned that enemies could be kind. They had learned that there were places in the world where women chose their own paths. These lessons could not be unlearned, could not be forgotten, could not be dismissed. In private moments, sitting alone at night, some of these women took out their treasures from America. A photograph creased from being carried, a chocolate wrapper carefully preserved, a handkerchief washed so many times it was thin as tissue. They remembered meals where they had eaten until they were full. They remembered learning English words that had no Japanese equivalent. They remembered American soldiers showing them pictures of their sisters and crying because they missed home. They remembered feeling for the first time in their lives like they were people instead of tools for other people to use. One woman, decades later, tried to explain it to her granddaughter. She said, "We laughed at them because we had been taught they were demons. We dreamed of marrying them because they showed us we were human. In the prison camp, we lost our country's lies and found ourselves. The cruelest captivity was the one we returned to, not barbed wire and guards, but a society that could not forgive us for surviving with our eyes opened." The paradox remained impossible to fully explain. Captivity had meant freedom. Defeat had meant awakening. The enemy had taught them truths their own country had hidden. The women who experienced this carried it for the rest of their lives, a secret knowledge that set them apart. They had seen behind the curtain of nationalism and propaganda. They had learned that human kindness could cross any border, survive any war, overcome any ideology. They had learned that the most powerful prisons were built not with walls and wire, but with lies repeated until they sounded like truth. And once you escaped that kind of prison, you could never go back inside, no matter how hard the world pushed you toward the door. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.